and then there we go, and then we'll get started. Looks like we have some people here already. Hey guys, we're gonna get started in a minute. I'm just gonna set up our YouTube live super quickly. I hope everyone is staying warm. It's pretty dang cold in DC, but I'm also spoiled. I know I'm not in the Midwest, so cold to me is not the same thing. All righty. Okay, cool. All right, people are coming in. They'll keep coming in as we go along, but we will go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, both on Zoom and who are watching on YouTube. My name is Brittany Kerfoot, the Director of Events at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's virtual event. Before we begin, I just have a couple of technical details to go over with you. First, I will drop a link in the chat where you can purchase a copy of today's featured book straight from Politics and Prose's website. And we ship to all 50 states. And you can also pick up your copy if you live in the DC area. We have 3 stores around the district, and you can select in-store pickup when you go to checkout if you would like to do that and not wait for shipping. Also, if you have a question for our author, please submit it in the Q&A space instead of in the chat. It's just much easier for Victor to get to them instead of waiting through the chat. So put it in that Q&A space and we will get to those later in the program. You can submit your questions about anything from writing process, the actual book, what the authors are doing in quarantine, anything you like, and you can put those in anytime between now and the end of the event. All right, let's get into things. Xavier Navarro Aquino is currently an assistant professor of English at the University of Notre Dame, where he teaches in the Master of Fine Arts program. His debut novel, Valorio, which means wake, follows a remarkable group of hurricane survivors searching for hope on an island torn apart by both natural disaster and human violence. Moderating today's conversation is Victor LaValle, author of the short story collection Slapboxing with Jesus, 4 novels, The Ecstatic, Big Machine, The Devil in Silver, and The Changeling, and 2 novellas. He is also the creator and writer of 2 comic books, Destroyer and Eve, and he currently teaches at Columbia University. So again, thank you all for being here, and please welcome our authors onto your screen.
Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be here having this conversation together. And I want to get us into a lot of different things, but I feel like the first thing I always want to say when I'm talking with someone who's got their debut out is first, congratulations. And welcome. You. Yes. And then this will seem like a silly question, but I hope it's not. How have you let yourself celebrate?
Oh my goodness.
The debut, because I feel like the mistake I made with my first book is I did not.
That's a very important point, mostly because I was on the verge of not doing such a thing. It took a good friend of mine, a dear friend, to remind me to celebrate, especially on the eve as the semester begins next week, here at least. Sort of procrastinating with the syllabus, while at the same time being existential about, all things considered. So I was on the verge of not celebrating, but at that evening we were able, my partner and I were able to go and get a nice dinner, which we don't often do mostly because we adopted 2 dogs, a German Shepherd and a small pit bull, and so they're very all-consuming. So I was able to celebrate, but it was only because I think I was reminded that is an important thing to do. Yes. Otherwise, I would just dwell in sort of the nonsense that often happens with sort of self-loathing.
Yes. Well, that's the reason I always like to ask it nowadays, because I do feel like it's a thing, as you say, like it's an important point to sort of stop for a second and be like, along with all the rest, you have all the dreams for the book, for the teaching, for life, for those 2 dogs, for the world, that it's important to sort of be like, okay, so at least we're going to go have a good dinner.
Yeah, and it's always, it's mostly strange because, of course, you know this, but always leading up to a publication, it's like this really slow crawl. And so it almost feels like it's been living with you for such a long time, not only writing it and then selling it in public and getting ready to publish, but when you receive those physical copies, it almost feels like it should be out in the world. So you sort of make that that acceptance that, okay, I have the physical copy, but it technically is not out for everyone to access when they want, if they want to. So it's a strange mixed bag of many, many emotions, but
yes.
Yeah.
And have you done the, like, I remember the other thing was when you get to then also see it in a bookstore, right? Like that's the next sort of moment of joy. And then you hide it because you don't want people to know you're celebrating, you're enjoying seeing your own book on a bookshelf.
Yes, actually a day early, if you would believe it.
You did.
The bestsellers had put the book out a day early in the Barnes and Noble here.
Oh, good.
Which was nice to see, but shocking. There is a picture of it. I don't have many socials, but my partner did take a picture of me, and I was kind of like rolling my eyes next to it.
Like you couldn't take it seriously, but secretly in your heart, there's also the joy.
Yeah, absolutely. No,
Yeah.
I think that's it right there. Yeah.
I'm so happy. Well, I'm just broadly speaking, just very happy to hear dinner and at least one photo as proof.
As proof that it's out.
It existed and that you were there watching it exist. Yes. Right. Okay, good. So now I want to then lead that into asking about the book itself. If we could, like, I'm going to ask if you would be willing to read it to us a little bit in a minute. But before getting there, I would love to know, like, what were the sort of the seeds of this novel? Like, how did it begin for you? And then how did it sort of grow into an actual novel?
Yeah, I've said this I think before, but I will sort of try to keep it brief because it is a relatively, it's not a long story, but as I think many Puerto Ricans, especially those who kind of witnessed the hurricane from afar, were going through a long process of grief and trying to come to terms with what was being experienced by those that we loved back by those that were back home, whether it's family or friends or loved ones. And so for a long time, I resisted writing the novel or even writing about the hurricane as a topic for the most part. It wasn't something that I immediately thought I needed to address because immediately after the hurricane, I was able to go home. About 5 days or so, give or take, I can't remember at this point, but it was immediately after because there was an obvious despair of not being able to reach anyone for the most part. And that was felt across the entire continent and probably abroad even, where no one could find or have access to communicating with their loved ones through all aspects of technology, right? Whether it's social media, whether it's phones. And surprisingly, later on after the fact, in hindsight, a lot of people seem to suggest that our technology kind of did us in, considering landlines are no longer a thing. And so people made the assumption that, or people made the assessment that had there been landlines still very much present, that governors could even communicate with each other, or mayors could communicate to the governor about what was needed in towns throughout the island. So it was very interesting to see that. But as much technology had developed and as we sort of modernity has become this everyday staple, at least in Puerto Rico, in many ways, it's a complicated thing. But that in itself was one of the main reasons why we couldn't even reach our loved ones. So I was able to go home immediately after, was lucky to land the flight, and seeing the aftermath in its most raw state was the moment that I think that stayed with me. Seeing sort of destruction of natural landscape was very much very shocking to process, because Puerto Rico is a very green and vibrant place, right? Even just naturally with its colors and sort of how you process the world and how you process the landscape, especially at night when it's very loud with critters and insects and things of that nature. And all that was absent. All that was essentially gone. And I think those things stayed with me because I was able to find my way back home and whatnot, and visit my mom and my brother, and then my in-laws as well. So that was something that I think was the beginning of the idea of imagining this dystopic reality, right? Seeing sort of despair in its in a very real space, seeing a society that depended on things like cash and no longer electronic transactions was another reality. And sort of the desperation of trying to find resources, or trying to find food and things like that. I had to walk through and work with my mom the little time that I was there for about 2 weeks, trying to essentially find things like gasoline and find things like helping her as much as I could. So that was the beginning of thinking about it, but I didn't write the novel until 2019. the fall of 2019 when I was at my residency at the McDowell residency in New Hampshire. And that was mostly because of Camila, one of the protagonists that opens up the book, the sister. She came to me in inspiration through a real life event of two sisters that they were both elderly sisters, but one of them was staying in an elderly home, and the sister thought that the best thing to do would be to take her from the elderly home and bring her home with her, so they could ride out the storm. And that inadvertently, where she was staying in the room she was staying in, a mudslide came through and essentially encased her and killed her. And so that image and that story and that devastation stayed with me. And I think it began the process of thinking about Camila as a character. And then in that fall, in that isolation with McDowell, I basically said, it's now or never, right?
Yeah.
I either write this or I may just continue to put it off and never address it.
So were you, so in that way, where because you'd mentioned resisting it for a bit, it wasn't that in that time between 2017, say, and 2019, that you were just planning. It was more like you were just trying to keep it at a distance.
Yeah, I think I was keeping it at a distance. I think that I felt Camila early on after reading that, because I read that story shortly after being able to return. I'm having that luxury and that privilege to return back while the rest of my family and the rest of my loved ones basically stayed in the aftermath. And so there was a lot of that juxtaposition of us being basically safe and fine with electricity and power and all the luxuries of sort of Western civilization in the United States, while knowing that everything that you grew up with and everyone that you loved was just basically roughing it and trying to make it through. And so I was in grad school, right? And so I kind of had to be back. I was teaching, I had a full course load of 2 classes. And so it was this very interesting management of trying to engage with those back home, but also remembering and thinking about that story. And I think that stayed with me. So the images of being there, but also how much none of that drastically changed, because we were able to go back that Christmas. So 4 months after, most of the islands still didn't have power for the most part. And so that was just a reminder of all things. And I think it wasn't until Camila started really as a character presenting herself that I accepted the fact that I needed to write and address this. Otherwise, I think she would have been very, very pissed off with me as a character and haunting me.
Well, I can't think of a better segue than to ask to hear from the book, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, of course. So I will, let's see if I have my book right here. I'm going to read a short excerpt from the beginning of the novel where Camila opens up the novel. And then I'm going to transition to another character that I think is a bit more self-sustained. The scene itself is a little bit more self-sustaining. So I'll do that, and then we can jump back in. Camila. It wasn't until after I dug out her body that I learned to love my sister, Marisol. You'd think it's strange to see destruction as a way to learn her, to grow with her and our people. But that's how it went. It started with the mudslide that came through and busted my bedroom window. As Huracán Maria raged outside, Marisol slept with all our dreams. No one can tell you how much pressure is outside during Huracán, in the rain clouds unstitched, the wind breezing, and the storm, a large squeeze in your entrails and a hum so loud you begin to forget. Those howls sing in tiresome anger. You feel your ears pop. La turbina de un avión is what mommy chanted throughout the night, and I felt our house tremble like I believed God was fuming. We all did. Mommy held on to us after the lights went. Mommy felt the ground shake from under our feet and walked with Marisol and me hand in hand to the bathroom. There we curled under the wooden vanity and she prayed, Dios will be here. He will. But what if he's not? Marisol asked. He will, I snapped back. That was all I could say or needed to say. She tugged on my dress at first, then moved her fingers away from mine, then left us there. Marisol, ya, mami, I'm going to sleep. So sleep here, nena. But she didn't listen. She went to my bedroom and shut the door. And that was it. Now I carry her with me. It started with me taking a piece of her, the tip of her pinky, the one that stuck out from the mud. I cut it from her hand with a shard of window glass only because Mommy told me that she is no longer with us, that we would have to wait for the people to come collect her. Mommy was too busy seeing me off, trying to nudge me away from all the dead satos washed up by Maria's currents. Mommy never checked up on Marisol, so I knew that it was okay. I never saw Mommy cry. When Marisol disappeared into my bedroom, Mommy simply went to the window and watched God deconstruct the landscape. Maria serving as his contractor. She stopped praying, but I knew she still believed. So I guess that's why I wanted to perform a resurrection. A week after Maria left, Mommy spent most of the day counting our water containers, checking to see if we had access to the river, to collect what little liquid we could to flush the toilets. She started whacking away with her machete at the web of branches that kept us for some time trapped on our end of the street. Her broad black shoulders flexed with every stroke she landed, her short hair disfigured and her mouth open and breathing heavy. She then started to ration out the little trash bags we had so as to not waste them. She said the mountain of filth would start collecting and we'd need every one of those bags because the garbage people were not coming. Not anymore. The only time Mommy seemed to show an emotion was when I used the toilet. I peed and flushed, and Mommy stormed into the bathroom with a broomstick and swatted my feet. Eso no se hace. Do not ever waste water like that again. Ma, I started to cry. I'm tired of the smell. I don't want to keep going on top. Cállate, Camila. If you flush again without letting more days pass, you will go outside. So I did. For some time, I took to peeing in the darkness. I tried to wait until I desperately needed to do it. Found a spot where two giant palm trees snapped in the middle and served as a natural barrier. Nothing but the quiet moon shining its light, helping me avoid making a mess. After the storm, there was no water in the colmado, and I needed to find Marisol some hydration for her lungs and for her wounds. Even though Mommy said not to talk to her, to leave her alone, I figured she needed water or food or something. I think Mommy was afraid because we were only prepared to keep hold for 2 weeks, hoping that aid would come all the way into the forest to us in Utuado. Mommy started losing faith as time passed, and that's when I started to worry. The roads were swept off the mountain and the river camped out in La Plaza, all that water around us, but none of it drinkable. This was before people got desperate. Some said they started collecting whatever was around. They started by setting all those dead things on fire just to taste something. When Mommy left me alone at night, I'd creep back into my room where a wall of crystallized mud trapped our poor Marisol. I'd open the door and see a sweeping brown river frozen in a wave. I worked to chip away at it, every piece of her showing as I jabbed into the petrified guck, slowly excavating Marisol back to life. During the daytime, I would walk around with Marisol's pinky in my dress pocket, and after a while, it started to stink. I missed her. Just after the huracan, like all people, I wanted to return to a normal state. So I took care to clean Marisol as best I could. It took a little time, but when I finally freed her, I dressed her with her favorite pair of jeans. They had a sharp tear on them, on the knee, that I thought looked distinguished. I found her nice blue blouse that had a smudge of dried blood on its neckline. Of course, Mommy was busy with the machete, so she soon moved away from our house and started on the bridge that connected us to El Barrio. I knew she was trying to clear a path to God, to ask him if he was planning on getting back to work anytime soon. Marisol, we need your help. I need you to wake up so you can help Mommy and the town. I shook her after putting clothes on her dusty body. I asked her to take me with her, wherever she had gone, so far and free from all the water and mud. I asked if she was willing to see through her closed eyes one more time, to try and leave all the green shades I imagined were in heaven, how the shine from the breaking waves and the ocean still captured the sun, that no matter how terrible the island looked, someday it would all heal. But Marisol just smiled. Her eyes shut away from the world. Okay, so this next part that I'll read briefly is from the perspective of Mori Vivi, another character protagonist in the novel. And she and one of her best friends, Damaris, are venturing, trying to find the infamous cult leader Urayoan, who essentially is promising a paradise in the center of the island. And they are still drifting, trying to find reasons to essentially go follow him. We saw people acting as birds fly today. It was midday, but the sky was overcast and it felt like late afternoon. Most days feel like late afternoon. After waiting at the Gulf for diesel, Urayoan disappeared. We decided to look for food in the old city they used to call Atorrey. We journeyed toward the Banco Popular and all the insurance skyscrapers once booming with life. This was before the calamity. The streets were now abandoned and the office edifices had blown windows. There were white tents spread throughout La Milla de Oro. Palm trees and thin hedgerows that used to line the avenues were uprooted or left alone and grown wild. The fine arts cinema with its grand entrance and escalator was looted and shards of broken glass littered the floor. There were no cars, and all their multicolor clogging the roads. The McDonald's and CVS no longer bustled with transit, the Burger King the same. We thought to stop in the Aquino on Roosevelt. Damaris had a friend who worked there restocking the produce and receiving grocery shipments. But as we crossed Roosevelt Avenue, we saw nothing down the road, a quiet mess, and I knew it wasn't worth seeing Aquino ransacked. I wanted to venture deeper into Atorrey and check on some people we knew who lived in Floral Park, a small cluster of rundown houses in the center of all the concrete and tall buildings. Damaris must have felt this, so she shook her head and insisted we keep pressing forward, closer to the center and to the people. We walked, and if you stopped for a moment, you could hear ghosts busy at work. Those echoes left behind after so much noise, vibrations and sound filled us both. Ghosts of people occupied with their business jobs, ghosts of men dressed in sleek pants and tight dress shirts, many fat from eating too much fast food, ghosts of women in office attire and the sharp click of high heels as they walked. If you stopped for a moment and closed your eyes, you could hear laughter or yelling, the humming of cars trembling idly at the stoplight, steaming under the violent afternoon sun. We stopped to hear those ghosts because Damaris was tired and the memory must have been soothing to her. La Milla de Oro was transformed into a shanty town surrounded by rows and rows of white tents, some with FEMA insignias, and that made Damaris angry. She still fumes about how the old government and FEMA dispersed emergency funds, such things as strange and foreign companies like Whitefish coming to our island, taking advantage of disaster, proclaiming a solution to the failed power grid. Emergency funds disappeared into unknown pockets. Proposals made to Amazon for the building of their second campus at Roosevelt Rosie Roads Naval Station were ignored, even after the Secretary of Commerce sold hard the idea of paradise. Instead, the old government kept thousands of bottles of drinking water and aid at Rosie. As our people disappeared in sight and death, the old government continued attempting to sell to us, to the highest bidder, all for progress and posterity. To this day, we're told the water and aid sit at Rosie, rotting away. We'd grown used to the constant misallocation of monies from the old government, where contracts were handed out, funds designated, then disappeared, while the proposed projects were never realized. We'd grown used to this, and even though we raised our voices and growled, we remained static. Continued reports detailed the old government was conveniently misplacing and losing many trucks filled with more aid. At first, we thought it was all Urayoan. But after news broke that mayors and the governor were in on these disappearances, Urayoan started looking more and more like a solution rather than a problem. We grew tired of all the promises. We started thinking more about the Reds and Urayoan's new town or city or Memoria, whatever it's called. It sounded more appealing as time went on. We continued with our hands linked. Homeless or abandoned people camped on the floor or made lines into the white tents. Officials dressed in vests and hard hats gave out scraps for food. I was sick of the waiting. Places like Florencia and everything isolated and rural were neglected, and Damaris was crying more these days. The tents with their FEMA wording signaled a false attempt that something was being done, but it made no difference to Damaris and me. So I took my knife and carved into one of the tents. I cut around the word FEMA and ripped the black letters from the white tarp. I threw it on the ground and spat on it. And Damaris smiled for the first time in weeks. Her long curly hair was disheveled, but her face, even stained and dirty, was beautiful. I wondered if it was time to find the reds and go to Memoria. We kept hearing popping, echo in the air, and could see afar something falling from the broken windows. I stopped one of the officers dressed in a vest. "Why aren't you helping with the older people?" I asked. I was angry. I held Damaris's hand as I kept repeating this to the officer. Why isn't anyone doing anything to stop the noise? People throwing things from those windows. I pointed to the building above and the officer ignored it. "If you want food, get in line like everyone else," the officer responded and pointed to the trail of people waiting to be fed. I grew impatient, so I tugged Damaris and we moved past them and kept walking. I didn't want us to stay there in that camp, because everything felt lifeless. So I feared that if I left Damaris there, she'd waste away in abandonment. The only means of finding this Memoria was through the Reds. They were spread through each major town and didn't always listen when you asked them questions. They had a reputation of running off like scared cats. "Can we rest, Mauri? Please, I'm tired," Damaris said. "We need to keep moving just a little more. I don't want us to stay here. You'll get sick if you stay here." "I'm tired, Mauri." "I know." We saw people acting as birds fall today. Damaris wasn't sure if they spread their wings evenly, but I knew they wanted to reach the sun. Pops like gunfire echoed in the long avenues, and the exposed metal frames from some of the empty offices trembled. I covered Damaris's ears. I knew the people dressed as birds were failing to spread their wings evenly, and Damaris was so tired, her eyes gray and dark from little sleep, her hands weak and fidgeting. As we walked through the camp, we wondered if this was the end, if this was how things would be from now on. Everything we grew up loving, now an afterthought. We remembered all the old songs playing on La Mega, the little money we'd spend shopping or cooling off from the heat in Plaza, getting dizzy and throwing up after riding La Caja de Muertos en la Feria, las fiestas patronales, el Festival de las Máscaras en Atillo, all of it. We waited in a dilapidated bus stop hoping the old transport would appear and take us away, anywhere. Then we saw her, an old woman with short white hair. We saw her in the American International Plaza building. The building used to house UBS or AIG or something of the sort, but now it wasted there with its blue windows blown and shattered. She was standing next to the edge of that exposed office. She must have worn a long white dress. I like to imagine her face, wrinkled with wisdom and anger and frustration. Her eyes heavy set and her skin blotched with an uneven tan. Her thinning but full head of hair was platinum. She was angelic, the old woman. She carried herself to the ledge and she looked so peaceful. Damaris noticed her and could only wave. Then I waved, and we were both down there below her, waving. Not an agitated or desperate hello, but something like mourning, her remembrance. And the old woman waved back. She presented herself to the air and she wanted to glide out into that openness. So she did. She let herself fall. At first it seemed like she would never rise, but Damaris and I kept waving as she fell forward and we saw her rise. Her long and torn dress flickered and opened and she fluttered over us like a pitirre. "Isn't she beautiful?" Damaris finally said. She held my hand as I hugged her. "Yes, yes."
That was wonderful. Thank you for that, for both selections. And I wonder if you could, there's a bunch of things I wanted to ask about, talk about character and all the rest, but I feel like what you just read leads into, I feel like, a theme that seemed to be a part of the novel, which was sort of the kind of leadership that steps in when government fails, right? And considering like where we're sort of ending up in the novel, things fail pretty bad, right? I mean, things go south. You thought they couldn't go more south, and they go more south. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just that idea. Like, if I'm misreading it, you could tell me that. And if I'm not, if you could talk a little bit about that as a theme in the novel.
Yeah. one of the things I kept thinking about as I was writing through the novel and then editing it, was who steps in to fill the void, right? Mm-hmm. Who steps in to fill the void for natural disaster? And oftentimes it's a community, right? If the government fails, communities band together and they come together to find solutions. And it was very much in a very realistic sense. Back home, the government wasn't there, so the people essentially helped each other, found resources, found ways of supporting themselves. But I wanted to imagine a possibility. And I wanted to imagine, even if it was a small possibility, because in many ways, the antagonist, if you want to call him that, Urayoan, and I'm very hesitant to call him an antagonist for varying reasons that we could be here for, I think, another hour, but he steps in to fill that void. And he recruits essentially a relatively small group of people to help fill his ideas and his fancy about what he means regarding salvation, regarding trying to start a new society that is essentially pushing back against colonialism, right? He's very much a product of this, and he himself, as when I was thinking about him, he reminded me a lot of Caliban and the Tempest, William Shakespeare's The Tempest, as a figure of post-colonialism. But in many ways, he's a very hypocritical character because he likes to point to others. He likes to call them out as if they're the ones in the wrong, and he's diluted and thinks that he's the only one that has the answers to all these things. And in many ways, I think that these things are sort of feeding off themselves. I can't imagine that this character didn't sort of appear in the vacuum. It appeared obviously with the political discourses that were occurring 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 4 years ago, ever since sort of that presidency was in place. And the way the country was sort of running. And so I wanted to imagine an authoritarian type dictator, but in a very small scale, because in many ways, regardless of how the events play out, he's still allocating his influence on a somewhat of a small group of population of Puerto Ricans that decide to go and follow him because they figured that there's nothing else that the old systems can offer them. And so they're playing with these. I'm playing with these desperations and these ideas of what happens and how easily things can falter, depending on circumstances and depending on what we inherit and how we approach these inheritances. And so he's very unlikable as an antagonist. I would say Urayoan, the protagonist, but
yes.
The antagonist. But in many ways, I think he lends himself to be misread, and that's okay. I don't think that a reader should necessarily give him a pass. But I would hope that a reader can slow down and read him at the sentence level, because what I had wanted to do with him was to sort of capture a sort of stream of consciousness, ranting style autocrat that has many moments of humanity in his terrible violence. And that is difficult to process for us, right? It's difficult to process that this authoritarian comes in and fills that void. But ultimately, in many ways, we dismiss that. If we don't have to count for his humanity, then we can just chalk him up as extreme and pure evil. But that's the nuance in the conversation, I think. So to me, it was about imagining and envisioning a society akin to, I did have like Lord of the Flies in mind, of course, as I was writing this, of how we can, out of desperation, buy into certain fallacies, certain ideologies. And they're not that, I mean, if we want to bring it into like contemporary America, they're not that peculiar or odd, considering January 6th a year ago. So it's not a strange thing. And I think that when desperation is heightened and magnified through natural disaster, you can have a spectrum of possibilities that are both the most extreme and terrible, but also the humanity of bonding and trying to come together for community, which I think that's what happens by the end of it if readers go through the journey.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, certainly I would say like there's also that aspect, like the built-in, like there's, for lack of a better term, like a quest aspect, right? For everyone, like they're trying to get there. And I have to admit, like I was impressed, like that you didn't blink, right? Like I feel like the that there's a version of this where it says like, it was so bad and these people traveled so far, let's give them something good, right? Or there's a version that says, let's go there. And as to your point about him, let's give him something pure bad. And instead to suggest that like, you can't journey out of humanity. Like wherever you go, as humans at least, I guess animals could get a break, but humans, you still end up with other humans. And so the sort of that idea that like the things that they're having to face or wrestling with, they're going to be there too, right? Like that seemed very poignant to me. And that like the daydream is you wish like when people suffer that sort of magically they can just be relieved of suffering somewhere. But at least on Earth, that has yet to be found.
Exactly. No, I think you put it well. I'm thinking in terms of how do these characters process their grief or their trauma, and I think Camila, I think, is the heart of this book. I mean, I don't think there's one specific protagonist, but I do think that Camila, in conversations, even with my agent before we went on submission, we had this long conversation about where is the heart in this novel, and it's almost like a unanimous, like it's her, and not mostly because she opens the book. I mean, it's easy to assume that, but it's mostly because she is in denial of that acceptance of losing the person that she loves the most. And that she is willing to sort of slip into these realities of her imagination to carry that body and carry her in spite of it decomposing, as an act of desperation, as an act of resistance to her being no longer present in a real sense. So it definitely plays into these possibilities as a whole. Yeah.
Well, I wonder, so we have 6 like major characters, right? Who we're cycling through. But at least for me, when I was reading it, I feel like a 7th character is the hurricane, right? And I wonder, like, to my mind, even though we're in the aftermath of it, it's there. She's there, right? And I wonder, and I felt like you made her a real persona. Like you personified Maria. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, because that to me is, it's like it's a high level magic trick, right? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how or why, number one, if you feel like that's accurate, and then 2, if so, how you went about making that feel so vivid.
Yeah, yes, it is accurate. She okay. Serves as another protagonist. Mostly because the aftermath of the storm, the aftershocks of the storm, will reverberate through generations, through the living generations, and those in many ways. When I was growing up, I was recounted of Hurricane Hugo in 1989. But I think one of the interesting things that occurs is that Puerto Rico fancies itself as a very modern state, a very modern place. And it sort of built up this hype in the 90s and in the 2000s, early 2000s, of this possibility of prosperity as being like a metropolitan space within the region of the Caribbean. But in many ways, that became as flawed and as inaccurate as could be when the ruse of government was removed. Then you had, in many ways, abject poverty exposed. And you realized how very poor the mass population on the islands are, and how difficult it is to depend on systems that were previously imposed through colonialism and that tried to govern in that way, and how those things don't function necessarily when you remove the sort of the guise of modernity, when no longer you have that present. And I think the aftermath of the hurricane, that the presence of Maria will forever be ingrained in this generation, and I think moving forward. And I think the most visceral way that this was captured was in 2019, the summer of 2019, when the protests on the island occurred, when they wanted to oust the governor, Rosselló, when he was currently in office. That was something unheard of, right? That you could, even though his terms were coming closer to the end, that unification of anger, it was this built up aggression and anger towards the inability to address sort of the systemic issues that were in play, and that these handing off of governments every 4 years, whatever political party was affiliated, did not have an answer to the reality of the everyday Puerto Rican on the island, that these needs weren't being met. And I think these things were presented through Maria, and Maria will forever be that position. It's always frustrating to see that when as long as time passes, we wonder about amnesia. We wonder about sort of those effects of media and whether or not these things will ever be forever cemented. But I think generationally, especially with the youth, we have a small shift, and I hope that small shift can be maintained, because I don't believe that these things are sustainable the way that things are currently in place, at least as far as like a system of governing and a system of structure. So yes, she's, as Maria as a character, she embodies an everlasting presence, albeit whether it's she is the manifestation of an extreme neocolonialism, and how she can always return. In a natural disaster can and will always return, especially in that region, it will always return. But more so, how these things are put into worse hands when you have climate change as its as a point of emphasis.
Well, yeah, it's like when I was, as we've been talking about it, like another sort of comparison that occurred to me was, I don't know if that story, The Mask of the Red Death. Do you know that one? I think Poe, I believe. And just that sense of like, in that case, like the plague comes and forces all these people together. And what it sort of reveals is all the ways that this society is corrupt, does not care for all. And then, and if I'm remembering correctly, like it ends with the Red Death essentially saying, "I'll be back." Right, I'm going to do this to you again.
That's right.
But of course, it seems strange to say during a pandemic you can't rely on a plague to keep coming back, but you certainly can rely on hurricanes, on the natural world, to keep coming back and sort of turning over the table, right, and reminding you of everything that's hidden, as you say, like. That's torn off. Anyway, but I wanted to take just a second because I see we have a question in the Q&A, and I just want to take a chance to read it. It says, why did you choose, I'm going to mispronounce it, I know it, Utuado for a location for this story?
Yeah, Utuado is
Utuado, excuse me.
Utuado, yeah. Utuado is sort of conveniently located in a very centralized zone in La Cordillera of Puerto Rico, the mountain range that splits the north and south. And I wanted to imagine a fictitious Utuado. I think one of the things that is important, and the novel tries to suggest, as Jasmine Ward does it with her Mississippi, is imagining a world that is not real, but it is real. So Utuado is a fictitious representation of the Utuado. That's it. So it's not an anthropological reflection of that place, but neither is the place where they're coming from, right? Most of these characters are coming from this town called Florencia, which doesn't exist. So I think the novel is trying to suggest, as other prominent and important writers have done before me, imagining a world that is as real as possible to reality, but actually very different and real. I think it's kind of doing this very interesting and important position. And so I wanted them to journey as far away from modernity as possible. And in the last 10, 15 years, there's been a significant flight away from rurality in Puerto Rico to the centers of modernity, whether it's San Juan in the capital or Ponce in the south, one of the other cities, or Mayagüez all the way in the west. And so there is a sense of everyone moving not only to these spaces, but also in a very real way, people moving away from the island to find opportunities in the States. So these things were interesting to me in thinking about how do we inhabit other spaces that are not as familiar to us, and how do these characters have to move between and drift through that carnage of natural space, away from sort of the the material carnage of buildings, of that sort of dystopic present to the natural space that is very much dead in the novel, right? That it dies, but that it comes back to life. Unlike in a different way, the products of modernity come back to life. There are different ways that these two things come back to life. And I think one of them is a very slow, gradual process, right? Nature returns, but it will always return. At least we hope it always returns, because if it doesn't, then we have to think about these things, and that is very concerning. Versus modernity wants to return as quickly as possible, because we need to try to turn everything into as normal as it can be, as it used to be, because if not, we cannot exist in our realities. So that's one of the main reasons, one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of moving the characters from metropolitan space to that rural space in the center of the island. And
can I ask, like, to bring that into a real world question, because you brought up like a generation of youth who were, if radicalized is the wrong term, politicized in some way in the post-Maria, I don't know, whichever term would feel most comfortable, right? Awoken at post-Maria, whatever it might be. Do you, in the real world, does it seem as though that is in any way spurring people to want to go back to the country, or is that just or is that move still continuing to feel like it has to be either the cities or the states?
You know, that is a major question, and it's an important one, because I think mostly about what is currently occurring back home, and it's that the island essentially is being sold off. In many different parts and many different aspects, whether it's the beaches or even parts of the country. And so we, as many Puerto Ricans from the island, and are very angry and upset about this. It's like Puerto Rico will soon be an island where no Puerto Ricans will live in. Like that is the fear, I think, that is happening, because Puerto Ricans are getting priced out. Puerto Ricans are getting gentrified. And I think this is not unique to Puerto Rico as far as other places that have been gentrified, of course. But in many ways, an island kind of presents itself with these interesting and difficult possibilities where rurality may end up being coveted by those who can afford it. And right now it's still present and affordable, but it's concerning to me. And I think it's concerning to every Puerto Rican who was born and raised there, and sort of saw things drastically shifting from what we deem as we can have stake to this place. But now, because of an opportunity, and so we need to venture to other places to find opportunity, we may never return home, and we may not find home the way it used to be.
Or even available.
Or even available. I mean, New York City is probably the best example of thinking about this in its most heightened way, right?
Well, you know, it's funny, as you were talking about it, I was thinking about, so we were living in Washington Heights, we live in the Bronx now, and thinking about during the 2020, I think it must have been the full COVID year. You know, my wife and I were both writers, both college teachers. I think there's a certain professional level of friendships that we have. And it was interesting to see who made the decision during COVID and who had the ability during COVID to say, this is getting too rough, New York is falling apart, all those kind of things. We're moving to the country, right? And so and for us, that meant, you know, it's an hour upstate or 2 hours upstate, whatever it might be. And then it was interesting, of course, to then talk to friends who, because say my father's originally from Syracuse, New York. So I knew through my brother and all these like local friends between Syracuse and New York, there are all these people, all the locals there who were like, you know, you're jacking up our house prices. And I can't afford to live like the place where we've lived for 4 generations. You know, I can't live here anymore because all these lawyers and college teachers and whoever are moving here to run away from New York. And I thought we would at least get you people to just stay there, you know? And so, I mean, I know it's not a one-for-one comparison necessarily, but it was interesting to hear from the folks who were locals of those places where they thought at the very least, this will always be ours. And then this pandemic hits and suddenly they learned, not if other people have more money.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that I have begun to see from afar, and it's been very painful to see. I grew up seeing having access to so much of the beaches and how that's no longer a reality. And I think very glaringly about one specific place that I used to visit as a kid in Arecibo on your way to Utuado, una cueva ventana, which is this used to be accessed if you knew how to get to it. It's this open cave in the mountains, and it opens up and you can see the landscape if you crawl into the cave. And that was that land was essentially bought, and then it was privatized, and now you have to pay to get access to that. Mm-hmm. And that has happened like continuously throughout all the natural spaces, like in a way that is very concerning. Yeah. And it's sometimes Puerto Ricans that do it. It's sometimes Puerto Ricans that sell the property to foreigners that end up doing it. But either way, it's one common culprit, which is like whether it's capitalism or whether it's things of that nature. It's very concerning, I think, and mostly because the youth, as angry as we are, we feel like we've moved towards a position of protest. And that's, I think, what occurred in the last elections, even back home, was that there was this quite a scare by the traditional parties that said, why are so many votes not coming to us, as they usually do, the two major parties, the statehood and the Commonwealth parties. And in fact, there was a third, essentially a new party that was moved in, that was predominantly pushed by the younger generations, people my age and younger, who are essentially fed up with it. Right. Are essentially fed up with that dynamic, and that they want to try, or they want to attempt something different. And there's optimism in that. I think there's an inherent optimism in that. And so hopefully, hopefully we can build off that.
Right. Well, even the beauty of, like, I always feel like for whatever ways older generations might say, these kids are coming along, as they always say, these kids are coming along to destroy this thing we have set up. I mean, I do always find it beautiful that they still voted, right? Like, they didn't burn everything down. They didn't destroy the thing. They said, we'll use your tools. And to my mind, I feel like that's people saying, like, up front, I'm willing to buy in, but I just won't give it to you. Like, I won't give you that power. Right. But I do think this system has, I'll still, as long as you don't destroy my ability to believe in this part of the system, that the voting does this, I'll still buy in. I'm like I always feel like that's like a incredibly like moving sort of testament on the part of youth again and again, which is almost always saying, I just want a chance to be a part of this. It's rarely, broadly speaking, saying, just throw it all away. Except if you're saying, like, I want to be able to own everything and charge people to come look out of the cave.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So certainly if that goes, I don't know if too many people who'd be crying over it, except for the owner, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
So in the last one, we have just a little bit of time left, but I would love to ask, like, talking about characters, if there are any of the characters from the 6 who you feel like you would just love to talk about a little bit, who maybe don't get as much sort of attention as the others, but they meant something to you, obviously, because they were one of those 6.
Yeah, I thought about this a lot, because it's interesting, since there is a cast. The poet Cheo doesn't often get addressed, I think, and I'm hoping that he does moving forward, because when I thought about Cheo as a poet, I thought about Derek Walcott, and I thought about the Schooner Flight, and immediately I thought about Sabine. But Derek Walcott is a very interesting figure, the St. Lucian poet, where he himself fancied himself, and he was a very talented painter of watercolors specifically. If anyone ever has a chance to actually look at his paintings, they're wonderful. And in many ways, that's kind of, I guess I channeled myself a little bit in that, is that I always grew up thinking I wanted to be a poet. And I think in many ways I still carry that with me, whether it's being a failed poet or being a poet that writes poetry in their fiction, as the character literally does. I mean, he's trying to compose poetry, he's trying to compose it, but he's very self-aware that some of it may not be good. right? And he's like, I don't know how to handle this. Maybe I don't have the talent. And he's so, very insecure about that. But he's a complicated figure, because I think what he's mostly concerned about is finding the value and the importance in the written word. And he believes in that. And he believes that in the power of language to change or to hold on to the humanity that is available to the characters. That's just why he's always writing it. He's crossing it. He's kind of brainstorming through it in a very literal way on the page. He's striking things out. But he quotes this in the book, where he says, like, poetry has kept us, poetry is what keeps us alive. And it's not necessarily poetry what he's referring to, but he's referring to writing, words, language, and the importance of it, and how it needs to be valued. But also, he's an interesting foil, or like the juxtaposing him to Urayoan, that believes language is in many ways the culprit of things, right? And he goes on these rants and these soliloquies about what language means to him, and the danger and the inheritance of language. Versus Child uses that as an opportunity to address the possibilities of hope through his writing, and how that is his account, and that is what he will leave behind. And in many ways, that is what he leaves behind. And he passes that over to the characters that find their way to this dystopic, utopic place. Dystopic mostly. We need to be clear.
Yes. Okay, I see. I actually see one more question in the Q&A, so I'd love to read it so we can hear your answer. It says, "Thank you so much for your vivid reading and for your reflections so far. You've hinted at this already, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you anticipate literary representations of natural disasters and our collective memory of them will evolve as once-in-a-generation hurricanes and similar catastrophes occur with increasing frequency." So that's a good bit. In 2 minutes, go.
I think that the novel tries to challenge this, or not challenge. I think challenge is not the word, but it's thinking about memory. It's thinking about what do we choose to keep and what do we choose to let go. And I think we've gotten very good at letting things go, and not in a good way. Like, we've gotten very good at forgetting. And that's what the characters, I think, are grappling with and trying to keep record of, especially Cho. If we were thinking about Cho to end on him, it's just that he's trying to keep record in desperation that this occurred, and that we cannot forget these moments, because we're very good at forgetting, especially if it's convenient for us to forget. So I would suspect that we're in a state where a lot of vulnerable populations are going to be affected by climate change the most. And what are the people that have certain influences or certain economic influences going to do about it? Well, we can fear, if we think doomsday, that they will do very little. and some of them have presented them incapable of doing much, because it doesn't benefit their bottom line. So it's one of these things that is very concerning about who's affected. And because if we keep touting, as one of my colleagues says, Roy Scranton at the University of Notre Dame, if we keep touting that what may concern us is this possibility that, because we're saying that populations of color, populations that are most disenfranchised, that are going to be affected most by climate change, then maybe that's the reason why there's inaction. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is worrisome beyond all doubt.
For sure.
Yes.
And depressing.
Yeah. Well, climate change shouldn't be. I don't think climate change is very, very optimistic.
It's not enough to be. It's not. But it's true that but that doesn't mean we don't talk about it, right?
That's right.
Because as you say, this is one thing you forgetting about it. There's only one way that leads.
That's right.
So
yeah.
And so on that note, I think we hit that hour exactly. And so I'm just so grateful that you let me be in conversation with you today. And congratulations again.
Thank you, Victor. No, I truly appreciate you coming on board, and thank you, Politics and Prose, as well, for having us.
Of course, it was our pleasure. Thank you both for joining. Everyone in the chat is saying they enjoyed this talk so much. And thank you to everyone watching on YouTube as well. This has been yet another virtual event from Politics and Prose. Hopefully one day we will see you guys in person, but if not, and here comes one of the dogs.
Hey, perfect.
Hey, buddy, just on time.
Yeah. That's Ghost.
That was the perfect way to end.
That's the pick
Always
me
with
up
the
at the end.
That's right. Yeah.
That's it.
Thank you guys again. And to everyone watching, stay well and stay well read. And we'll see you next time.